foolish little Zionists, with your utopian mentality, you'd better go down to the factory and learn the workers' reality. You'd better go down to the factory and learn the workers' reality.
Yellow fellas, on today's episode, we're going to be talking about Zionism and its long history of fascist collaboration. Now, making a connection between Zionism and fascism has always been a tricky thing to do. A lot of Zionist mythology nowadays revolves around Zionism being the proper way for the West to make up for its crimes of the Holocaust, and also a lot of Holocaust museums themselves are associated with Zionist groups or the State of Israel. And no doubt, besides the economic reasons that they voted for the partition of Palestine and the creation of the State of Israel, in 1948, the UN member states' votes in order to create Israel were in part motivated by the memory of the Holocaust. However, their biggest mistake was rewarding Zionism and the Zionist ideology for the suffering endured by the millions of Jewish people under the Nazis. As Zionism was a movement that was completely different than the millions that suffered under the Holocaust. The simple matter of the fact is that Zionism was not what suffered in the Holocaust. It was millions of innocent Jewish people. Because Zionism directly collaborated with fascists, anti-Semites, imperialists, colonialists, and the Jewish people that suffered under the Nazis did not. Zionism was a movement separate from them, outside of them. So first of all, we have to talk about the foundations of Zionism, just to give a brief history of it. Zionism found its birth in the late 1800s of Europe. During this time, there was a major trend of scapegoating Jewish people for all the issues of capitalism. There's always a minority group or an ethnic group or an out group always chosen whenever capitalism reaches its inevitable conclusions and has issues. And so in the late 1800s, there would be a lot of czarist programs and, of course, most famously, the Dreyfus Affair in France. Um, the founders of Zionism were mostly middle-class Jews. They mostly also saw Zionism as a tool to use anti-Semitism in Europe. So basically, what they saw was that anti-Semitism in Europe was inevitable, right? That there was no reason to fight it in Europe. And in fact, they would sometimes see anti-Semitism not as a threat to be organized against, but actually as a tool to persuade Jewish people in Europe to immigrate to Palestine. And Zionism was founded in the fact that the active support of anti-Semitism could bolster the foundation of the Jewish state. As Israeli journalist Oreya Harai would write in 1969, quote, "It is of course not customary to talk about it in public, but many of us felt a tiny bit of joy when we read newspaper reports about the rise of swastikas in Europe in 1960 or pro-Nazi movements in Argentina," end quote. So you really need to understand, Zionism is rooted in the idea that Jewish people do not belong in Europe, that anti-Semitism is inevitable, that we should not fight for Jewish rights in Europe. Jews who fought for Jewish rights in Europe were called assimilationists. And that ultimately, since anti-Semitism is natural, we should use it as a tool to get Jews out of Europe to move to Palestine. These ideas would even be found in the founder of Zionism, Theodor Herzl, who would say, quote, "In Paris, as I have said, I have achieved a freer attitude towards anti-Semitism, which I now begin to understand historically and to pardon. Above all, I recognize the emptiness and futility of trying to combat anti-Semitism," end quote. During the Dreyfus Affair that I mentioned previously, a French Jewish general was wrongfully charged of treason by the anti-Semitic leaders of France. Herzl would be more mad at Jewish people for organizing against the Dreyfus Affair than actually the anti-Semitic leaders of France themselves. He was angry that Jewish people were daring to organize for rights. Ultimately, then, this attitude that Herzl and all the Zionists favored, I will dub anti-Semitic accelerationism, which is just coined in this podcast. Is not an actual term, but it would be where Zionists would actively support anti-Semitism in the hopes that it would further push Jews towards immigrating towards Palestine. And there's many examples of this all throughout history. Another example of anti-Semitic accelerationism from early Zionists would be when Karl Lueger, a deeply anti-Semitic politician, was elected in Vienna. Theodor Herzl would be his biggest supporter. So you can really see how crazy these people were. When Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe began to flee to Western Europe because of a bunch of pogroms, something that the anti Semitic leaders of Western Europe and the people of Western Europe who were anti Semitic absolutely hated, Theodor Herzl's solution was to ship them out of Europe to the Holy Land. He would actually go in front of British Parliament saying, "You guys don't like Jews? Well, just ship them out to Palestine." In fact, the first president of Israel, Chaim Weizmann, when he looked back onto this anti-Semitic rise of Eastern European Jewish migrants fleeing to Western Europe, would say, quote, "The aliens bill in England and the movement which grew around it was a natural phenomenon. Wherever the quantity of Jews in any country reaches the saturation point, the country reacts against them. The fact that the number of actual Jews in England and even their proportion to the total population was smaller than other countries was irrelevant. The determining factor in this matter is not the solubility of Jews, but the solvent power of the country. This cannot be looked upon as anti-Semitism in the ordinary or vulgar sense of that word. It is a universal social economic concomitant of Jewish immigration that we cannot shake off. Through my views on immigration, naturally, we're sharp conflict of this." End quote. So really, he was just saying anti-Semitism is natural. As you can see, Zionism has always been based on the idea that anti Semitism is the most natural reaction to Jewish people existing outside of Israel. That's going to happen, and that there's no reason to struggle against it ever. The people who would try to fight for Jewish rights would be called assimilationist Jews. And that, in fact, it's a great tool to weaponize and scare and politically motivate people to go to Palestine and occupy it. So Zionism throughout most of its history was not popular with working class Jews. It was only popular with middle class Jews, right? So for working class Jews, the promise of a theoretical state made no sense to them. They just wanted to fight for their rights now and here and to exist within their societies. Zionism was also born in a time of colonialism and rising nationalism as capitalism developed in Europe, with it being born uniquely out of this context. Herzl would even proclaim, quote, "We should there, in Palestine, form a portion of rampart of Europe against Asia," end quote. Zionists wanted a nation for the Jewish people. However, they were completely disconnected from the ground in Palestine itself, being hundreds of miles away in Europe. So they would have to negotiate and get favors from the countries already occupying said lands. First, they would try the Ottomans. Zionism, therefore, was not anti-colonial, as is often painted today. You'll see a lot of Zionists nowadays saying that Zionism was decolonial, Zionism was this, that. No, the early founders of Zionism were actually very openly colonial, very openly imperialist, and negotiated with imperialist colonial powers. It was a movement that worked happily with colonial empires to get a pie of it for itself. Many early Zionists even had no idea what Palestine was like. When Max Nordau, an early Zionist and friend of Herzl, learned that there were actually people living in Palestine, he would say, quote, "I never realized this. We are committing a great injustice," end quote. With Zionist eyes set on getting Palestine from the then waning Turkish Empire, the Turkish Empire was it was called the sick man of Europe. They would try to get the favor of Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany. Herzl, in order to get the favor of Kaiser Wilhelm, would actually promise that by supporting Israel, Kaiser Wilhelm will get rid of the Jews in Germany. And Wilhelm himself hated the Jews in Germany. He was supporting Zionism because he saw Jews as behind most of the socialist and communistic uprisings against him. And so he was behind the state of Israel as long as it got rid of his quote unquote Jewish problem. In this, you can see how easily Zionism worked with the anti Semitic structures of Europe. His German strategy would ultimately fail, however, and Herzl would then meet with Vyacheslav von Plehve, who was the first Tsarist official to organize pogroms against Jews under Tsar Nicholas II. That's who the Zionists would work with, the guys who organized pogroms against Jews. Von Plehve himself used to be a supporter of Zionism as long as it meant Jews left Russia, but he'd become angry at the movement when it started demanding rights for Jews within Russia itself. Herzl would manage to get the Russian state to support some backing of Zionism, but mostly only for the immigration of Jews out. They would not back any rights for Jews, any organizations that were fighting for the rights of Jews within Russia. Herzl was fine with this, though. He would even tell other Russian Jews at the time to stop fighting for their rights. To the working class Russian Jews, this idea was not popular at all. Why should they stop fighting for their rights in the land of Russia because of the promise of a theoretical state? So, as you can see, Zionism was only really popular with the middle classes. Towards the end of his life, Herzl would almost destroy the whole World Zionist Organization. The World Zionist Organization was the main Zionist group. There will be another one founded by a split called the New Zionist Organization, but for now we'll be focusing on this one. By the beginning, he would almost destroy it by starting talks with the British about starting in Israel and Kenya, since Palestine was not on the table tangibly at that time. This would be a move so unpopular that it will almost get him assassinated. Thankfully for the Zionist movement, though, Herzl died before his actions could cause a rupture within the World Zionist Organization. During the First World War, the Zionists would try to get on the good side of Western European governments like Germany and the UK as much as possible, and that would end up working with the passing of the Balfour Declaration in Britain, which would promise the support of the British Empire in creating a Jewish state within Palestine. While Britain passed the Balfour Declaration, it was at the same time backing white armies in Russia in the brutal civil war in Russia, which were doing pogroms against Jewish people. The Zionists would stand by and let the pogroms that the UK government was funding just happen. Ultimately, the promise of Zionism was attractive to many European powers because it promised that the Jewish people of Europe would disarm themselves politically as a bloc, which fundamentally challenged the anti-Semitic and capitalist governments of Western Europe, and would instead leave the continent, allowing the Western European governments and their political systems to remain intact. Zionism would ultimately not mobilize any resistance whatsoever to England's pogroms in Eastern Europe, as it needed the support of these empires. In Eastern Europe, with the Bolshevik victory, the Russian state would support Jews and end anti-Semitism, but would label Zionism a British and reactionary nationalist movement. In response to this, Eastern European Zionists started allying with anti-Semitic nationalists. They would ally with the Ukrainian nationalists who did several pogroms against Jews and would stay within the Ukrainian nationalist white army branches, Zionists within Eastern Europe, until the white Ukrainian nationalists started doing pogroms so disgustingly that they were forced to leave. Likewise, in Lithuania, Zionists would also ally with the nationalist government of Lithuania before it too became too openly anti-Semitic for them to collaborate with it. As you can see, rather than fighting anti-Semitism, Zionism in fact relied on anti-Semitism of imperialist powers. Arthur Balfour, the man who himself created the Balfour Declaration that would promise the British support of a Palestinian state, was himself a deeply anti-Semitic man. And he wanted the expulsion of Jews from Britain. The Zionists' other greatest allies would be the burgeoning bourgeois of the Middle East, the old feudal rulers. Many rich families within Palestine would sell them land. Kings like Abdullah of Jordan would help them partition land in Palestine. It should be noted that because the Zionists didn't try to fight anti-Semitism, Jews all over Europe, called assimilationist Jews, had to fight for their rights on their own. And the rights that Jews have won within Europe, for their rights to exist, have been despite Zionists, not because of them. Herzl himself was an atheist. His ideology was rejected by many rabbis, and early Zionism did not even believe in promoting any Jewish culture or language. After Herzl's death, Zionism would next go to Germany, led by figures like Martin Buber. It would lead to the creation of Blood Zionism. Blood Zionism would be an idea that Jews did not belong in German society and were part of a unique blood. This blood Zionism would mix the strong German nationalism and ideas of pure blood that were gaining ground within Germany at this time. The German Zionist movements would believe that the Jewish people were of pure blood and should not racially mix. Ignaz Zollschaft, a Zionist anthropologist within Germany, would be one of the most foremost advocates of not allowing the Jewish people's blood to be tainted by lessers. You can sort of see this play out into logical conclusions today with how Israel bans interracial marriages between Israelis and Palestinians. Blood Zionism ultimately believed that the Jewish people were one of the purest races, but also believed that since they were outside of their homeland, Israel, that since they did not have their own state, they were leeches and parasites on other European societies. One Blood Zionist publication would even write, quote, "The Jew is a caricature of a normal, natural human being, both physically and spiritually. As an individual in society, he revolts and throws off harness of social obligations, knows no order nor discipline." This sounds more akin to Hitler, but no, actually, it was in fact a Zionist. While blood Zionism eventually faded away, the major branches of Zionism that would arise after Herzl would be labor Zionism and revisionist Zionism. We'll talk about revisionist Zionism later, but for now we'll focus on labor Zionism. Labor Zionism was mostly made up of middle class Jews that would claim to be socialist, but they believed that fighting the class struggle outside of occupied Palestine was useless, and that Jewish workers were wasting their times fighting for their rights in Europe. So this would lead a lot of the Jewish working classes to instead go towards socialists and communists. Why would they work with labor Zionists who believe that organizing for their rights outside of Palestine, occupied Palestine, was completely useless? The labor Zionists themselves would be ignored by most working class Jews because this was an insane proposition. Saying ideas like, quote, Jews are in the wrong country, in the wrong occupation, and the wrong politics, end quote, found them more in common with the Nazis than the average Jewish worker. One labor Zionist would even say, quote, to be a good Zionist, one must be somewhat of a good anti-Semite, end quote. Because Zionist propaganda nowadays is so heavily tied with the myth of them being the proper answer to the Holocaust, you might assume that Zionists were the biggest opponents of the rise of the Nazis, that they were organizing against the Nazis. They were, in fact, doing the exact opposite. The Zionist Federation of Germany would drag its heels in opposing any anti-Semitic acts committed by the rising Nazi party in the late-stage Weimar Republic of Germany. The Zionists of Germany would refuse to organize against the rising Nazis until they could no longer do it. In fact, the Zionists of Germany would oppose anti-Nazi activity more than anti-Semitism itself. As one German Zionist in the Weimar Republic would say, quote, if we do not admit the rightfulness of anti-Semitism, we deny the rightfulness of our own nationalism. If our people is deserving and willing to live its own national life, then it is an alien body thrust into nations to whom it lives, an alien body that insists on its own distinctive identity, reducing dominion of their life. It is right, therefore, that we should fight against us for their national identity. Instead of establishing societies for the defense against anti-Semitism, who want to reduce our rights, we should establish societies for the defense against our friends who desire to defend our rights. End quote. He basically said, we have to fight the people who are fighting for Jewish rights more than people who are fighting against anti-Semitism. This is Zionism. Organizers of the Zionist Federation of Germany would even refuse to form any alliances with other Jewish groups against Nazism or anti-Semitism, seeing their main concern to be establishing the state of Israel. In the end, the Zionist Federation of Germany would spend more energy organizing against communism than fascism in the final days of the Weimar Republic, handing the Germans power. The Nazis power. Everybody was German. While German Zionists refused to do anything about the rising Hitler issue, Zionists outside of Germany were even worse. Chaim Weizmann, the head of the World Zionist Organization, and again, one of the first presidents of Israel, would say in 1912, quote, each country can only absorb a limited number of Jews if she doesn't want disorders in her stomach. Germany already has too many Jews, end quote. It's not so surprising then that Weizmann never even tried to organize anything against the rise of Hitler's power, with him in the last days of the Weimar Republic hoping that the anti-Semitism would actually increase immigration to Palestine. Zionists, through their accelerationist anti-Semitism, came to believe in the same ideas as the rising Nazis, that Jews did not belong in Europe, and ultimately would not put up a fight against to Nazism, believing that fighting for any Jewish rights within Germany was useless. But it's not only within Germany that the Zionists would work with fascists or even allow fascists to win. In Italy, they would court Mussolini directly. Mussolini, as the originator of the fascist ideology, was not opposed to Jews joining his movement. He would opportunistically say anti-Semitic things, but in the end, there were 4 Jews that helped found the Fascist Party of Italy. Therefore, Mussolini throughout his entire rule was wishy-washy on his support in Zionism, sometimes supporting it, sometimes not, sometimes, speaking one thing and doing another. Eventually, this would lead to him becoming closer to the more anti-Semitic fascist strains in Germany and of Hitler, which would lead to an ultimate break with all Zionist organizations. But during the 30s, he would be very close to many Zionist organizations. Because by the time that Mussolini had become friends with Hitler, he had a very good relationship with the WZO, the World Zionist Organization. After Mussolini's march on Rome, the WZO would immediately get an audience with him, the Zionists promising that they would remain loyal to Italian fascism. Mussolini himself still saw Zionism as a tool of the British, so he was skeptical, but he was willing to discuss with them. Chaim Weizmann, the leader of the World Zionist Organization, would meet with Mussolini in 1926, and he would say of that meeting, quote, Mussolini was more than cordial. He offered help to the Zionists build up their economy, and the fascist press began printing favorable articles on Palestinian Zionism. After a meeting with Nahum Soklow, the Zionist, fascism and Zionism would become full endorsers and supporters of each other in the early 30s. With that last meeting, Mussolini became lionized by Zionism, as Soklow would write. Soklow not only praised the Italian as a human being, but announced him as a firm believer that fascism was immune to anti-Semitic preconceptions. He even went further. In the past, there might have been uncertainty about the true nature of fascism, but now we begin to understand its true nature. True Jews have never fought against you, end quote. And I'm sorry, that wasn't a quote by Soklow. That was a quote by Lenni Brenner, I believe. And then that last, we begin to understand its true nature. True Jews have never fought against you, is by Soklow. As one Italian Zionist would proclaim, the new conditions will bring about a revival of Italian Jewry when he was talking about fascism. Indeed, we have evolved a philosophy of Judaism akin to spiritual tendons of fascism, long before this had become the rule of life of Italian polity. Hitler's rise to power would be heavily thanks to the inspiration and ideological framework that Mussolini gave him. Both would quickly form a relationship. However, Hitler himself would have two gripes with Mussolini. One, his suppression of Germans in some northern Italian areas, and two, the amount of Jews that were present within his government. Mussolini himself would at first chastise Hitler's anti-Semitism, and this would actually make Zionists flood towards Mussolini, believing him to be the more moderate fascist. Let's go back to Germany. With the rise of Hitler and him in power, German Zionists would see many similarities with themselves in the new regime, leading to the German Zionists on multiple attempts trying to get his support and backing. The German Zionist plan was to get German backing for an orderly retreat of Jewish people of Germany to Palestine. This would even get the backing of Baron Mildenstein of the SS Corps, who would write several pro-Zionist articles. Yes, the SS Corps wrote several pro-Zionist articles. And Baron Mildenstein of the SS would even go to occupied Palestine to see how the Zionists were colonizing it. In March 1933, Hermann Göring, a head Nazi official, would even make a deal with the Zionists to fund a delegation to go to England in front of the World Zionist Organization and Jewish organizations. The delegation, funded by the Nazis, Zionist organization, would argue that there was no anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany, and would be used as a propaganda tool against many of the press that was being published about the Nazis and all of their horrific acts. So Zionists would work directly with the Nazis to be propaganda pieces and spread pro-Nazi propaganda. The Zionist delegation would even talk to Jewish leaders in New York and tell them to stop organizing boycotts against Nazi Germany because they would threaten and hurt Nazi Germany's economy. German Zionists would even oppose other Zionist organizations, proudly proclaiming that their relationship with the Nazis were allowing them to, quote, organize thousands and to transfer large sums of money to Palestine, end quote. Zionist newspapers in Germany would even have an editorial called, quote, wear the yellow badge with pride, end quote. And I'm not making this up. This Zionist publication said, wear the yellow badge with pride, and would blame German Jews for their fate in the Holocaust. Ultimately, German Zionists thought that fascism was inevitable, and they would hope that Mussolini's more inclusive and less anti-Semitic fascism would win out over Hitler's more anti-Semitic fascism. In addition, they would embrace the eugenics of the Nazis, saying, quote, we who live as a Gruyere, as a foreign race, have to respect the racial consciousness and the racial interests of the German people absolutely, end quote. German Zionist Joachim Prinz would be one of the most racist Zionists, whose works would even be cited by the Nazis, with him pushing towards complete reconciliation between Zionists and Nazis. Nazis, not Nazis. Even when the Germans published the Nuremberg Laws, which heavily discriminated against Jewish people within Nazi Germany, Zionist love for the Nazis didn't stop. The Pioneer Center, which was a Zionist organization full of Zionist youths, would continue to hope to work with the Nazis to immigrate Jews to Palestine. They would even publish newspaper articles for the world to see as propaganda pieces for the Nazis, saying that the German laws, the Nuremberg laws, were actually good for Jews and that their anti-Semitism was overblown. As the Nazis became more and more oppressive against Jews, the Zionist organizations within Germany would actually hope that this would lead them to getting a deal with the Nazis made, that the Nazis would eventually allow all the Jews of Germany to go to Palestine. So they would not put up any effort against the rise of the Nazis. Up until the worst brutalities of the Holocaust and the Nazi regime, the Zionists waited for that fated day when the Nazis would give them the deal that they sought to export the majority of the German people to Palestine. That day never came. And when it never came, they didn't even bother organizing politically. Zionist collaboration with the Nazis was pre-built into their ideology, with its ideas of the inevitability of anti-Semitism and its utilization of anti-Semitism as a tool of migration to Palestine. While the Jewish peoples of the world were organizing a major boycott against Nazi Germany, the World Zionist Organization was actually buying and selling Nazi trade goods. In one of the most damning actions of Zionism, Sam Cohen, an owner of a Tel Aviv citrus company, would manage to get a $400,000 deal made with the Nazis, whose economy was experiencing major issues from boycotts all around the world by Jewish groups. The Zionists would help the Nazis subvert boycotts by other Jewish groups. In addition, the World Zionist Organization, with the help of Cohen, would manage to get German funds back to them, which had been frozen by the Nazi state. In return, the WZO and Sam Cohen, for those funds that they got from Germany, would tell every single British politician to oppose a boycott of Nazi Germany. By 1933, a Zionist Nazi pact known as the Havara would be signed, which allowed for $3 million of German goods to be sent to occupied Palestine to help further settle the region. The Zionist settlers, who were horribly outnumbered by the native Palestinians, desperately needed the Havara. The Havara building would become a huge banking and trading house with 137 specialists, all funded by the Nazis. For the Jewish people of Germany, the Havara was the only way they can make sure that their money was safe, with them transferring their money outside of the country. But for the Zionists, it was fuel for the settlement of Palestine. A whopping $40 million would end up going through the Nazi trade deal between the Zionists called the Havara, making up 60% of the capital invested in occupied Palestine between the years 1933 and 1939. This would allow occupied Palestine to have an economic boom, despite the rest of the world being in the midst of the Great Depression, which was going on at that time. The only other economy to not experience the Great Depression was the Soviet Union, of course. So, um, you know, one was a socialism, one was funded by the Nazis. Guess which one's better? The USSR. I don't know why I went on this weird side tangent. I'm sorry. I'll get back on topic. Huh. The World Zionist Organization would even help the Nazis find new clients for their goods. They would organize and negotiate on behalf of the Nazis with the Egyptian government, the Lebanese government, the Syrian government, and the Iraqi government, and would even help Nazi ships get through boycotts into Europe. In 1936, Siegfried Moses would establish the International Trade and Investment Agency Bank in London, and it would help organize the sales of Nazi products within Britain itself. Even after the Nazis did the Night of Broken Glass, Werner Flechenfeld, the manager of the Havara Bank in Israel, would continue to offer reduced rates to Nazi shipments to Europe. The biggest benefactors of the Havara would be the Nazis themselves, who both got to solve their quote-unquote Jewish problem and subvert international boycotts against them. And so Zionists in the end would become the biggest pawn of the Nazis in every step to the rise to power. As one member of the World Zionist Organization would even say, Emil Ludwig, quote, Hitler will be forgotten in a few years, but he will have a beautiful monument in Palestine, end quote. For the World Zionist Organization, Hitler's rise finally meant the Jewish people of Europe would stop trying to fight for their rights in European societies and would leave for Palestine. Zionism had become an ideology in which the millions of Jewish people in the diaspora no longer mattered. All that mattered was getting young immigrants to build the twisted Zionist state. Enzo Cerini of the WZO would say much later, quote, we have nothing to be ashamed of in the fact that we use the persecution of Jews in Germany for the upbuilding of Palestine, end quote. While the Nazis worked with the WZO, they themselves had a mixed history of Zionism. Hitler had previously denounced Zionism in Mein Kampf, But, however, in July 6, 1920, he had come to believe that occupied Palestine was the proper place for Jews. And Nazi newspapers all throughout the 20s published both pro-Zionist articles and saw it as a perfect way to get rid of Germany's Jewish problem. Nazis throughout the 20s would shout out slogans like, quote, K words to Palestine, end quote, that slur against Jewish people. I'm not going to say it for you. And in fact, whenever they saw Jewish people, they would shout out, get ready for Palestine, and would hold up banners saying, get ready for Palestine, all throughout the 20s. The Nazis would even make a children's board game called Judenraus, in which kids would play with pawns that represented Jews, and when they kicked all of the pawns or the Jews out of the country in that board game, they would shout off to Palestine. The Nazis would use the Havara as a propaganda win, too, showing that they were not anti-Semitic after all, as the press labeled them as. However, while the Zionists believed that they could really push the Nazis to reform out their anti-Semitism, the Nazis did not return those feelings. As a Nazi internal memo would say, quote, just as now we have friendly relations with Soviet Russia, though Russia as a communist country represents a danger to the National Socialist state, we shall take the same attitude towards the Jews. If they establish themselves as an independent nation, they will always remain our enemies, end quote. While the Zionists believed that this pact, the Havara, represented a shift in Hitler, the Nazis' position was always clear. The Jewish people would be their enemies, and this was just an opportunistic alliance made in the moment. Baron von Mildenstein, the head of the SS's Jewish department in 1934, would make the SS branch of the Nazis one of the most pro-Zionist factions of the Nazis. This was done after Mildenstein visited occupied Palestine, in which he saw what Israel was like and became completely encapsulated by the Zionist project. Baron von Mildenstein's influence would even lead to Goebbels creating a swastika and Zionist David Star medal. So the Nazis would literally print a medal which had the swastika on one side and the Zionist Star of David that's now on the Israeli flag on the other. That's how deep their alliance was. And you can search it up right now. Search up the Zionist Nazi medal. It's the craziest thing to look at. On one side is the fucking swastika, on the other side is the fucking Star of David. And this was made to commemorate the alliance that they had. It's the fucking craziest thing I've ever seen. For SS members, the Zionists were great. They didn't attempt to fight for Jewish rights within Germany. They recognized that Jews were a separate race, and they got rid of Jewish people from Germany. With the passing of the Nuremberg laws, which would set about one of the darkest eras for European Jewry, Zionist newspapers would meet it with pleasure. One part of the Nuremberg laws that's been completely forgotten is that almost every single flag in the country of Germany would be banned, except for the Nazi flag and the blue and white Zionist flag that flies in Israel today. Those were the only two flags allowed in Germany. And you can search it up in the Nuremberg laws right now. Heinrich Himmler, in 1934, seeing that there were still Jews within Germany, would attempt to even further push Zionism into every single Jewish organization within Germany, hoping that to increase support for Zionism and give Jewish people no other options would cause them to leave Germany. Later on into the Nazi regime, the Gestapo police would even be told to treat the members of the ghettos that were part of Zionist organizations better. The World Zionist Organization itself saw most German Jews as not desirable for settling Palestine, using the Nazi pact they made to focus on sending money out of Germany more than people. They would leave most of their German Jewish brothers and sisters to die in Germany. The Nazis would continue to repress Zionist organizations and allow them as much as they needed. Again, their support for Zionism was opportunistic. At the end of the day, Zionists were just a short-term tool. And in fact, once Hitler was done within Europe, he even planned to invade Israel if it was ever set up. Between 1933 and 36, 164,267 Jewish immigrants would come to Palestine, which would balloon their population from 18% of Palestine to 29%. Palestinians never accepted these settlers and rioted multiple times in 1920, 1921, 1929, and most famously in 1934. Each time, the British would come to the safety of Palestinians and brutally crush. They would come to save the Jewish settlers and brutally crush the Palestinians. The Nazis would even seek to maintain British rule over Palestine. They saw the Palestinians as Semitic people that did not deserve self-rule. As much as the Nazis might have hated England, they would much rather have the English rule Palestine than the Palestinians themselves. For the British themselves, the foundation of Palestine was their greatest gift they could ever get. As Sir Ronald Storrs would say, quote, a little loyal Jewish Ulster in a sea of potentially hostile Arabism, end quote. Zionists recognized from day one that the foundation of a Zionist state meant the destruction of the Palestinian people. Labor Zionists themselves would stop Arab seasonal workers from organizing for socialist rights. Zionist socialism only meant rights for Jewish people, not Arab workers. In 1938, the Nazis would even make a deal with the Zionists to arm them to fight the Arabs. And even though this deal never went through, it would show how close they were to the Zionists. Paradoxically, of course, the Nazis and Hitler would even back the Grand Mufti of Palestine, and so would Mussolini. Honestly, the Mussolini and Hitler and all these groups, they play off of each other, and they didn't want the Zionists getting too strong either. In 1937, two SS officers would visit Israel, from invitation of the Israelis themselves. One of them, upon visiting Israel, would say, quote, if I had been a Jew, I would be a fanatical Zionist, end quote. There you go. And Nazi is saying if he had been a Jew, he'd be a Zionist. And the WZO, during the 1930s, would even begin to spy for the Nazis. When Jewish communists in the American Communist Party were proposing an alliance between them and the WZO, the World Zionist Organization, I should remind you, in order to boycott Nazi goods, the WZO were rejected. They were in a trade agreement with the Nazis. They didn't want to boycott their goods. This would be one of the many failed attempts by other Jewish groups to pressure Zionists to create a coalition that could have at least pressured or stopped the Nazis. The WZO throughout the 30s would continue to build broad alliances to fight against The WZO throughout the 1930s will continue to refuse to fight against the Nazis and build any broad alliances with other Jewish groups to fight against anti-Semitism or fascism. You know, one of the most paradoxical things about Zionism is the more that they got deals for the settlement of Palestine, the less they worked or even were involved in the lives of millions of Jewish people, especially in Europe. All of these actions that we've talked about so far were done by labor Zionists. Now it's time to talk about revisionist Zionism, which is important because the current ideology that rules Israel under the Likud party is revisionist Zionism, and it has been ruling Israel since 1977. Revisionist Zionism would be founded by Vladimir Jabotinsky, who was closest collaborator was Benzion Netanyahu. Does the last name Netanyahu sound familiar? Yes. Benzion Netanyahu is the grandfather of Benjamin Netanyahu, the current prime minister of Israel. And since 2005, Vladimir Jabotinsky has even had a national holiday within Israel on August 4th. Despite revisionist Zionism being so popular in the modern day, when it first started out, Vladimir Jabotinsky and his revisionist clique were seen as the most hated and crazy part of the Zionist organizations. And when Jabotinsky died in 1940 of heart failure, he would die politically isolated, alone, and sad. However, since then, his ideas have been able to win over the Israeli state and the Zionist movement, and they've had a stranglehold on Zionism since the 70s. Revisionist Zionism was founded on the idea that the Zionists need to drop Britain immediately and take Palestine violently for themselves, that Palestinian occupation wasn't happening fast enough under labor Zionists. Jabotinsky would also push the idea of the Iron Wall. It was the idea that the Jewish people had to form a strong military to brutally kill and replace the Arab people, who would never allow their lands to be taken peacefully. While many Israelis today say that Zionism is decolonial, Vladimir Jabotinsky himself said, quote, Zionist colonialization must be either terminated or carried out against the wishes of the native population. This colonization can therefore be continued and make progress only under the protection of a power independent of the native population, an iron wall, which will be positioned to resist and pressure the native population, end quote. In addition, Jabotinsky would also say, quote, if you wish to colonize a land in which people are already living, you must provide a garrison for that land. Zionism is a colonizing adventure, and therefore it stands or falls by the question of armed force. Netanyahu himself has expanded the Iron Wall theory, with him in 1993 stating, quote, a Jewish state can only be created from a position of overwhelmingly military strength by providing arms to by proving in arms to the Palestinians and the Arab states that Zionism cannot be defeated. End quote. Revisionist Zionism would be one of the most fascist-friendly branches of Zionism. it would proudly and openly collaborate with fascists. Jabotinsky himself began his political career in 1922. The first ally he would have would be Maxim Slovinski, a White Army general who would be known for carrying out pogroms against Jews. After this, he would join the WZO and form a coalition within it. By 1931, the revisionist Zionists held up to 25% membership within the WZO. With British protection for Zionism and the project in Palestine slowing down, Jabotinsky and his revisionist allies would begin to look towards Mussolini for funding for their Iron Wall. In 1930s, he would even go as far as to set up a party school for revisionist Zionists in fascist Italy, in direct collaboration with the fascist government. Revisionist Zionists would be heavily inspired by Mussolini. They would even wear brown shirts and would come to believe that worker strikes were high treason in Israel. So they would organize paramilitary brown shirts that would brutally crush worker strikes in Israel. In the 1930s, when the Italian fascists began to move away from the WZO, seeing it really as an extension of British interests, they would become very entrenched with revisionist Zionism. In fact, the Italian fascists would lovingly dub revisionist Zionism the fascist of Zion. In 1934, the revisionist Zionists would even be allowed to set up a Jewish faction in Italy next to the black shirts. Vladimir Jabotinsky and his clique would break away from the World Zionist Organization in 1932. The first revisionist Zionist Congress, called the New Zionist Organization. Okay, so now from now on, I'm going to be referring to the World Zionist Organization. That's the original one that the revisionist Zionists broke from. The revisionist Zionist Organization is called the New Zionist Organization, or the NZO. So there's the WZO, which is the original, and the NZO, which is the revisionist Zionist one. And this gets very confusing, I know, but I'll try to clarify wherever I can. The first NZO, the Revisionist Zionist Congress, was supposed to be held in fascist Italy, in Trieste, Italy, eventually with the support of Mussolini. Eventually, it would end up being held in Vienna, but the fact that they were considering holding it in Trieste, Italy, shows how close they were to Mussolini. Other Zionists, like Ben Gurion and Chaim Weizmann, would even call Vladimir Jabotinsky Vladimir Hitler. Everybody knew that the revisionist Zionists were very openly fascist. Mussolini would even say about the revisionist Zionists, quote, "For Zionism to succeed, you need to have a Jewish state with a Jewish flag and a Jewish language. The person who really understands that is your fascist, Vladimir Jabotinsky." Wolfgang Wiesel of the revisionist Zionists would even proclaim that the movement, quote, "in general sympathizes with fascism," end quote. In Israel, the revisionist Zionists would even set up a newspaper called Yomen Shel Fascisti. Do you want to know what that translates to in English? Diary of a Fascist. And the revisionist Zionist followers would even wear brown shirts reminiscent of the Nazis. Jabotinsky's militia of revisionist Zionists, called the Irgun, which would be a militia within Israel, though, occupied Palestine is the proper term. The Irgun would be most famous for bombing the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, where the British administration was set up. Jabotinsky himself would become Mussolini's biggest public defender within the Jewish world. He would write pro-Mussolini articles in defense of Mussolini and would see Mussolini as the biggest possible ally in the settlement of Palestine. The Grand Alliance between revisionist Zionists and Mussolini would ultimately end as Mussolini aligned himself more with the openly anti-Semitic Hitler, leaving Jabotinsky sad, isolated, and to die alone politically in 1940. But the connection was strong. Jabotinsky's Bateram faction would even viciously attack other Zionists in Israel. Jabotinsky himself, though, was not a fan of the Baterams, who themselves called themselves Jewish Nazis. The Bateram faction would even say, quote, "Yes, we revisionists have a great admiration for Hitler. Hitler has saved Germany. Otherwise, it would have perished within 4 years. And if we had to give up his anti-Semitism, we would go with him," end quote. Some revisionist Zionists looked fondly towards the Nazis as their brothers. Batar Monthly magazine in America would even declare their support for Hitler, saying that, quote, "Be Hitlerism, we are Hitlerites," end quote. When the Nazis came to power, some revisionist Zionists would celebrate it. George Koreski, a revisionist Zionist in Germany, would be inspired by the Nazis' beer hall putsch and would even try his own beer hall push in the Jewish community. Koreski would become enthralled by Hitler and would move closer to him. Koreski and his revisionist clique would immediately begin attacking other German Zionists who they saw as Marxists, and in 1934 would even try to rat them out to the Nazis. However, what Koreski didn't realize was that these German Zionists were already working with the Nazis in the Havara Agreement, the trade agreement. And so the Nazis did nothing about Koreski's attempts to get rid of his Zionist opponents. For Jabotinsky, Koreski's group and Hitler were a big headache for him. Jabotinsky really wanted to be a more reasonable fascist and would follow the Mussolini line as opposed to the Hitler line. I know it's crazy to say moderate fascist, but really, this is what we're working with when we're talking about Zionists. Soon, the revisionist Zionists were known for the Hitler Party, though, despite Jabotinsky's best attempts to separate themselves from Koreski and all the other revisionist Zionists that were working with the German state. Koreski's clique would be called the State Zionists and would become Hitler's favorite type of Zionist. The Gestapo members would even say, quote, "The State Zionists have proven to be an organization which has tried in every way, even illegally, to bring its members to Palestine, and which, by its sincere activity towards immigration, meets halfway with the intention of the Reich's government to remove Jews from Germany." End quote. I almost said Italy there. Oh my God. Koreski would even become a direct line of communication for the Gestapo within the NZO, the New Zionist Organization. So Koreski would do pro-Hitler propaganda for the Hitler and the Zionists. The Nazi government within Zionist circles. Koreski and his clique were immensely unpopular with the Jewish communities of Germany. Most German Jews hated Koreski because, he was just a direct Nazi. As Hans Hingel, who was in charge of pushing Koreski onto the Jewish groups, would say, "I have consciously allowed the Zionist movement, Koreski and his clique, called the State Zionists, to exert the strongest influence upon the cultural and spiritual activities of the Culture Bond, or the Culture Leagues, because Zionists have given us the formal guarantees of cooperation in acceptable form." Koreski would be appointed the head of the Berlin Jewish community, the Jewish Culture Leagues, and promoted to the head of religious congregations and charitable functions of Jewish people by the Nazis. All of these would ultimately fail, though, because the Jewish masses hated Koreski to his core. In 1937, when Koreski was depositing a check, he would quickly be found to be doing bribery and making illegal loans. This would lead to him being chased by a Jewish mob into his home and arrested by the German police. That would effectively end Koreski's career. Another of Jabotinsky's collaborators, von Weissel, who was his main negotiator in Europe, would meet with Sir Oswald Mosley, a British fascist who was in charge of the British fascist groups, and would propose an alliance between Britain, a possible revisionist Israeli state, Japan, Poland, and Germany. While Jabotinsky's supporters openly aligned themselves with the Nazis, it should be mentioned Jabotinsky himself privately hated this and would tell them immediately to stop allying themselves with German fascism. While revisionist Zionists supported Mussolini wholeheartedly, unlike the labor Zionists who had the Havara, the revisionist Zionists would actually, the clique supported by Jabotinsky and led by Jabotinsky, who was the main head of it, he would actually be a moderating force within the WZO and the Zionist community. He would oppose the Havara Agreement and even support some boycotts against the Nazis. So compared to the labor Zionists and the WZO, Jabotinsky, even though he was a direct fascist, would actually be somewhat moderate on the Hitler issue, which is crazy. The revisionist Zionists aligned with Jabotinsky would proclaim about the Zionist-Nazi pact, quote, "These men have now decided to sell for money the honor of the Jewish people, its rights, and its security," end quote. Jabotinsky ultimately underestimated the threat of German fascism. He believed that Hitler's regime would collapse on its own, and therefore he didn't need to organize much against it. Ultimately, the revisionist Zionists would not be interested in fighting Nazism in the European theater either. And in fact, they would try to further conquer Palestine. When the Nazis partitioned Czechoslovakia, the revisionist Zionists began to organize a secret invasion of Tel Aviv. And 24 hours before Hitler's troops marched into Poland, an armed boat of revisionist Zionists landed in the beaches of Tel Aviv. These revisionist Zionists would seize government buildings in Jerusalem for 24 hours, hoping to start a revisionist Zionist version of the Easter Uprising in Ireland. Though it would be defeated, the revisionist Zionists would manage to get the British people to give Israelis more independence. But their ultimate hope would be that the Jewish people of occupied Palestine would have risen up in this armed uprising and taken more Palestinian land and broke off with the British. On immigration to Palestine, so often we are told that Palestine is the only safe place for Jewish people, and that many Holocaust victims went to Palestine. However, the British were the ones who decided how many Jews were sent to Palestine, and they would often limit the amount of immigrants. Immigrants to Palestine would also be screened to make sure they weren't communist, and rich Jewish immigrants would always get priority. For a small time in the 30s, the Jewish immigrants to Palestine, the main source would be from Poland. However, Zionists would absolutely hate this Polish immigration. Chaim Weizmann would proclaim, quote, "They brought the atmosphere of the ghetto to Israel," end quote. This would lead to Zionists seeking only Jews that were committed to Zionism to give the limited amount of travel visas that Britain had to. And in the midst of the most anti-Semitic sprees in Europe, they would be less focused on saving Jewish people from the Nazis and the Holocaust, and more on making sure that the people that did come would contribute to the Zionist project well. The Zionists would only choose young, healthy, and committed Zionists to go to Palestine, not Jewish people. As Enzo Serini would say, quote, "Even in the most difficult hour, we must allot most of the 1,000 immigration certificates to the pioneers, young, healthy Zionists. This may seem cruel, but even if the British were to grant 10,000 certificates instead of the 1,000 they are giving us now, we would say, let the young people go, for even if they suffer less than the older ones, they are better fitted to the task in Palestine," end quote. So you can see, during the Holocaust and the Nazi regime, the Zionist biggest priority wasn't saving the Jewish people of Europe. It was getting people to Palestine that would settle Palestine the best. The interest of Palestine always subverted the interest of the Jewish people in Europe. And that was their number one priority, settling Palestine, not saving Jewish people in Europe. The WZO would even soon refuse to take Jews that were not rich enough and would not be able to do serious investment in occupied Palestine's economy. They would also refuse to take Jews that were older than 30. They wanted good workers and committed Zionists only. As one Zionist in charge of immigration said, quote, "We know that we are not able to transfer all of German Jewry, and we will have to choose on the cruel criteria of Zionism," end quote. With only a limited number of certificates to give, a good number of them would be given to Jewish people outside of Germany and Poland. Ultimately, a lot of the certificates would be given to Jewish people in countries that were not even under threat of anti-Semitism or the Holocaust. 2/3 of all German Jews that applied for immigration to Palestine would be turned down. But American, Turkish, and South African young Jewish men would be allowed into Palestine during the time of Hitler's rise. And they were not in any danger in Turkey, South Africa, and America, but they were in Poland and Germany and Eastern Europe. But the Zionist project was more important than saving the Jewish people of Europe to the Zionists. In the 1930s, America was like a very deeply anti-Semitic country. President Roosevelt himself did not want to address anti-Semitism because it would alienate a major part of his voter base. As a result, America would really limit the amount of Jews that were allowed to immigrate to America. American Zionists themselves refused to even try to fight for better immigration laws for the Jewish brothers and sisters trying to come to America. They refused because opening up America meant that Palestine would get less focus, and because if Jewish people had other options to immigrate to, they would immigrate less to Palestine. Meanwhile, when handing out immigration quotas to Palestine, the Israeli economy was the most important thing at the end of the day. Chaim Weizmann would later on go to proclaim, quote, "The old ones will pass. They will bear their fate, or they will not. They were dust, economic moral dust in a cruel world. 2 millions and perhaps less. The rest they must leave to the future, their youth," end quote. During the most vital time for the Jewish people, Zionist movements stopped mattering to the majority of the Jewish people. The majority of the Jewish people did not care about Zionism during the Holocaust, especially after the British limited immigration to Palestine. In 1936, of the 61,000 Jews that immigrated to Palestine, only 17,000 were from Germany, with the rest being from countries that did not need where Jewish people did not need saving. In fact, when the British proposed to save thousands of Jewish children, Ben Gurion, a future prime minister of Israel, would respond, quote, "If I knew that it was possible to save all the children of Germany by bringing them over to England and only saving half of the children by transporting them to Israel, I would opt for the second alternative. For we must not only weigh the life of these children, but also the history of the people of Palestine." End quote. He literally said he would rather have Jewish kids die if it meant less of them went to occupied Palestine. Ultimately, not only would Zionists fail to save hundreds of thousands of Jews throughout the 1930s, by allowing them to come to Israel, they would actively bar them from fleeing to other places, preferring that if Jews had other places to immigrate and not Palestine, they would not have them immigrate at all if Palestine was not on the table. In the most faithful hour of the Jews, the Palestinian economy mattered to them the most, the occupied Palestinian economy. On Hitler's rising anti-Semitism, the WZO, the World Zionist Organization, would try to pressure Hitler to reform his anti-Semitism. The WZO would attempt to rely on Mussolini as a moderating force on Hitler. The WZO would meet with Mussolini multiple times, hoping that they could get him to ally with the British and also fight for German Jews' rights. In 1930, Weizmann would even offer Mussolini capital in the creation of a pharmaceutical industry within Italy, through better trade alliances between them and Israel. Goldman would continue to negotiate on behalf of Zionists for Hitler through Mussolini, promising both dictators that the World Zionist Organization were doing their best to stop the anti-Nazi boycotts against their economies. During the 1930s, Mussolini would appear to be pro-Zionist to the Zionists. However, he was a two-faced liar. He would work on both sides secretly. As Mussolini would say openly, quote, "I am a Zionist. I told Dr. Weizmann so. You must have a real country, not that ridiculous national home that the British have offered you. I will help you create a Jewish state." End quote. However, despite saying that, he would also be working with Hitler secretly. With Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia, the Zionists would fight to stop the sanctions being placed on Mussolini's government, declaring him a great friend of the Jewish people and of the Jewish state. However, in the end, the WZO would be forced to side with the British in that conflict. The Ethiopian War and the Spanish Civil War would finally show Mussolini's true side to the Zionists, and he would drop the Zionists, favoring a full alliance with Hitler. Mussolini, however, even though he was done with the Zionists were not done with Mussolini, continuing to show him goodwill. Goldman would say of Mussolini in 1937, even after he had dropped the Zionists, "Jewry remembers with thanks the loyalty of the fascist government." But in the year 1937, the ultimate demise of the Italian fascist and WZO cooperation would be near. Austrian Zionism would also be another curious case of working with anti-Semites. Austria was a country created after World War I, and it had a strong social democratic movement, which would violently combat anti-Semitism and fascism. The workers of the social democratic movement in Austria would violently attack those who brought anti-Semitic ideas to the country, though they were still coming in and seeping in inevitably. The Zionist movement in Austria, called the JNP, was very small, and most Jews supported the Social Democrats, not the Zionist party. The JNP's main goal was ultimately getting away as many votes from the communists and allying with the Christian Social Party and the Nationalist Austrian Party. The JNP would even back the fascist Himwar militia against communists and socialists. And even though the Himwar militia, was openly anti-Semitic, the JNP would say that their biggest enemies are, quote, "the socialists, the atheists, anti-nationalists, and the anti-capitalists are really the Jews' biggest enemies." So the anti-capitalists were the Jews' biggest enemies. The socialists and the atheists and the anti-nationalists were the Jews' biggest enemies. But the fascists, who were openly anti-Semitic, were not. And the JNP allied with the Himwar militia happily, which is okay. In 1934, when the Social Democrats would be brutally crushed in Austria with the bombing of 3,000 workers in the Karl Marx housing project, the JNP would deny all of it. In fact, they would even deny the Austrian government's rising anti-Semitism. The Zionists of Austria would even back the government as it began persecuting Jews, hoping that they would somehow save them from the worst fate of a Nazi takeover. The government that they backed, the JNP, would ultimately secede Austria to Hitler without firing a single shot. They ultimately ended up on the wrong side of history in that conflict. The JNP, in fact, would go even as far as to claim that news about Jews being persecuted in Austria was exaggeration when it was actually happening. And when the Austrian government supported segregating schools, the biggest supporters would be the Zionist JNP and segregating schools of Jewish kids. When the Austrian government, in order to remain in good standing internationally, needed to appear not anti-Semitic, Zionists would help it do just that in its propaganda. In Eastern Europe, Zionist collaboration with fascists and anti-Semitism would not be much better. In Czechoslovakia, Zionists would act as supporters of Czech ethnic domination over other ethnicities and would not try to stop the government's anti-Semitism. In Romania, where the Iron Guard, which was a fascist group slogan, was Jews to Palestine, the Zionists would do nothing to stop the rise of anti-Semitism in that country, allowing it to eventually fall to the Nazis. Because of their ideology, wherever they went, Zionists refused to fight for Jewish rights and form alliances with other Jewish groups. In the brutal Spanish Civil War against fascism, people from all over the world would come to fight the fascists. There would be a couple Israeli fighters and soldiers in that war. However, the Israeli newspaper Haaretz would denounce the few Zionists that came to fight fascism. And Israeli and Zionist society overall would denounce the brave Jewish fighters in Spain that fought against Franco's fascism. As one pamphlet would say, quote, "Our Jewish ideologists have always denounced these types of Jews. This revolutionary middleman who pretends to be an internationalist, a rebel, a warrior, a hero. He is actually so abject, so cowardly, so spineless when the existence of his own nation hangs in the balance." In 1973, the Israeli veterans of the Spanish Civil War who fought against Franco's fascism would be publicly shamed by Israeli society for not having stayed and fought Arabs and Palestinians. In Britain, Sir Oswald Mosley would be one of the most famous fascists in British society and would lead a group that would attempt to pressure Jewish communities and threaten Jewish communities. The president of the Jewish Agency in Britain would say, quote, "There is fascism in Italy in which 50,000 Jews live in amity and safety. The Jewish community is not a political body and should not be dragged into the fight against fascism," end quote. Zionist leadership in England would drag its heels in opposing Mosley's British fascist group. Even young Zionists wanted to fight it, but the Zionist leadership would refuse to. The leaders ultimately reasoned that the building of Israel was more important than fighting fascism at home. The vast majority of Jewish people in Britain would completely ignore the Zionists and join communists to fight the fascists, who would defend the Jewish communities of Britain against Mosley's fascist private militias without the support of a single Zionist group. In America, the fascist group, the Bund, would hold an infamous Madison Square Garden rally in which thousands of fascists would declare public support for fascism in the middle of New York City. The only group that would organize a boycott and protest outside of the Bund Madison Square Garden rally would be the Trotskyist Socialist Workers' Party, Jewish groups in that Trotskyist party. In regarding this a major event, American Zionists would not condemn the American fascist group, but actually the socialist Jews that were protesting them. And even the Zionist groups would send letters to Madison Square Garden saying to let the rally go ahead. One Zionist organization in New York would say, quote, "Our Zionist policy is to take no part in politics outside of Palestine," end quote. Ultimately, the Trotskyist group would get 50,000 people to show up to protest the 20,000 Nazis inside Madison Square Garden. It was a great success. However, even though many Jewish groups, communists, and anti-fascists would come, not a single Zionist group would be present. One of the oddest Zionist groups were the Chinese Zionist community. The Chinese Zionist movement was made up of small groups of Russian Jewish communities that had immigrated to China, about 19,000 people in all. The Russian Jewish community was mostly made up of rich Jews who had fled Russia during the Civil War, and therefore they were instantly attracted to revisionist Zionism. There were also Arab Iraqi Jews, but they were not interested in Zionism at all. They were businessmen who had come there for trade deals, and they didn't care about Palestine. Zionism is a European ideology. Iraqi Arab Jews did not care. These Russian Zionists in China, when the Japanese took over China, would instantly become incorporated into the Japanese puppet kingdom and would become the Japanese occupiers' greatest allies. This would lead to the foundation of the Far Eastern Jewish Council, which would do the job of spreading Japanese propaganda on the Japanese Empire's behalf. The Japanese would acknowledge Zionism in return. The Zionist would try to get all Jewish groups around the world to support the Japanese Empire and its occupation of China. They would even try to start a little sort of Israeli Jewish state within China with the help of the Japanese. It wouldn't work. It would never be that successful. But they would try, which was a weird little thing. The Chinese Zionist movement would ultimately end when the Soviets moved into Manchuria and ended Japanese occupation. Kaufman, the leader of the Eastern European Council, the Eastern Jewish Council, the Chinese Zionists, would spend 11 years in a Siberian prison for his collaboration with the Japanese. In Poland, the Zionists would not be supported by the Jewish masses at all. Most of the Jewish masses of Poland would be in the Bund. The Bund was a Jewish organization that organized community efforts to rid Polish society of anti-Semitism. Zionism would become almost completely irrelevant within Poland after the British limited the amount of people that could immigrate to Palestine. And Poland itself was a deeply anti-Semitic society. Anytime Jewish members of parliament would try to say something, they would often be met by cheers of other parliament members saying, off to Palestine, or K words to Palestine. Despite this, both the WZO and the NZO would attempt to work with the anti-Semitic Polish government. Wiseman of the WZO would manage to get Polish support for their partition of Palestine in some hypothetical future. Polish Zionists themselves would run the idea that, quote, Poland has 1 million more Jews than it can possibly accommodate, end quote. Zionists of Poland would disavow all anti-fascist and anti-Semitic organizations done by the Polish Bund. So they would refuse to work with the Polish Bund under anti-fascist organizations. As the new Zionist organization leader in Poland would say, quote, it is absolutely correct to say that only the Bund waged an organized fight against anti-Semitism. We did not consider that we had to fight in Poland. We believe that the way to ease the situation was to take Jews out of Poland. With the German invasion of Poland, the Jewish people of Poland were set on a dark course of the Holocaust. The Bund would fight the Nazi occupation of Warsaw till the very end. The Zionist leaders of Poland would try to get out of Poland when the Nazis invaded, while the Bund fought them. With the Nazi takeover of Warsaw, a Jewish council would be set up as their puppet, headed by Zionists. This Jewish council would be headed by Zionists because the Nazis had already collaborated with Zionists in Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia and knew that Zionists were the perfect middlemen for their occupation. Zionist leaders would flee the country. As one was fleeing, he would hear from a fellow Jew, quote, you louse, I will not forget you, you louse, how you pretended to act as a leader and now you're running away with others like you, leaving the masses in this horrid situation, end quote. Zionist leaders left Poland for occupied Palestine so fast that most of the Zionist organizations and Jewish organizations within Poland struggled to find new leaders. Jewish councils run by Zionists and Nazis would help enslave and work the Jewish population of Poland before the Nazis fully set up ghettos. These Zionist organizations would take bribes from rich Polish Jews and make poor Jews work in the place of the rich ones. Some Zionists, like Avram Ganowitz, would directly spy for the Nazis in the Gestapo. Jacob Gens, a revisionist Zionist, would even become the chief of the ghetto police and would have those who tried to resist the Nazis arrested. The leaders of the Bund, the anti-fascist Jewish organization in Poland, will continue to resist the Nazis and the formation of ghettos. And communist Jews would join the Soviet Union in organizing a Jewish underground in the German to attack the Germans in the Polish woods. Zionists, meanwhile, in order to fight the Nazis, would try to fight within the ghettos and reformist means. They would put up a weak resistance that almost did nothing at all. The Polish government was now in exile in London. However, the Polish government in exile was still very deeply anti-Semitic. When the Polish government was presented by a plan by other Zionists to segregate the Polish army, they happily agreed. What this segregation of the Polish army of Jews meant was that most of the Jews within the Polish army were dismissed. The reason the Zionists had supported segregating the Polish army and had presented that plan to the Polish government in exile was because they hoped that this Polish contingent could be used to occupy Palestine in the future, which is crazy work, man. Crazy work. The Jews in the separate army would not be treated well. The Jews who were segregated would get less food, they would have higher death rates, and they would be left to starve and get shittier supplies. The Polish Jewish army would be called the Anders Army, and eventually it would be transferred to Persia. The segregation plan threw a big wrench into the fighting force that the Polish could muster. Before segregation, 40% of new enlistees to the Polish army were Jewish people. That number seriously dropped after they segregated the army. When the Polish government in exile arrived in occupied Palestine, their openly anti-Semitic leaders discussed deporting Jews. The Zionist leadership in Israel would help hush up statements that they made about deporting Jews out to Hitler after they won the war from the Jewish press and the Israeli press. When the British Parliament would even try to punish the Polish army for being anti-Semitic, the Zionists would stop them and not let them persecute the Polish army. Ultimately, the Zionists were more than happy to collaborate with an army that openly segregated Jews and gave Jews worse treatment. Even though the Zionists were in the perfect position to pressure the Polish government to become less anti-Semitic and had multiple chances to do so. When British immigration quotas were limited, the WZO and NZO would also illegally immigrate thousands of Jews from Europe to Palestine. But they would not immigrate people who needed saving, but people who could colonize Palestine the best. For the revisionists, quote, the first ones that must be saved must be Jews able and willing to carry arms, end quote. On occasion, they would illegally immigrate Jews that were not good for colonizing Palestine, but that would only because they would be forced to by the Nazis, or they would be bribed by rich people to forcibly immigrate them. Illegally immigrate them. The WZO would only seek illegal immigrants that, quote, had an affiliation to a Zionist body, good health, and so on. There is also a rather low age limit, end quote. Relatives of Zionists, high-standing Zionist leaders, and rich Jews would all get special treatment in these illegal immigrations to Palestine. Poor and unskilled Jews would be left behind in Europe to die by their Zionist brothers. When the British did catch the WZO importing Jews illegally to Palestine, they would deport about 3,000 of them. WZO would put up no fight to this because, well, they're basically a puppet of the British, and they needed British backing. The WZO would even go as far in 1940 to say that the NZO, the revisionist Zionists, were not being selective enough in choosing the Jews that they got. They would say, quote, among other things, the revisionists made a virtue of the fact that their immigrants are not selected. They take all the old, the sick, and the psychologically unfit for pioneering, whereas we presume to choose, end quote. So basically they were saying we we're better at choosing good Jews to settle Palestine than you guys, which is a crazy work. The Zionists themselves' main focus during World War II was occupied Palestine, with them being fine leaving the majority of European Jews to hang dry to the Nazis. As one Zionist publication in 1939 said, it would be useless to make sacrifices for their sake, talking about the Jewish people of Europe who suffered under the Nazis. The World Zionist Organization would even be told by America to stop sending aid packages to Polish Jews, right? So they were sending some aid packages to Polish Jews. Do you know what they did once they were told to stop? Not only would they stop sending aid packages to Polish Jews, they would pressure all other Jewish organizations within America to also stop sending uh, aid packages to Polish Jews on the American government's behalf. The Molotov announcements in 1941 was the first large-scale confirmation that the Nazis were killing Jews systematically. It would be discussed in the media and would become a firestorm. The WZO, the World Zionist Organization, would dismiss the Molotov announcement as Bolshevik propaganda. On August 16th, 1942, Richard Lichtman would send an urgent report to Palestine, talking about the horrific German killings of Jewish people. In response, the people of Jerusalem, the Zionists of Jerusalem, would say, quote, "One has to learn to experience to distinguish between reality and harsh imagination," end quote. Essentially calling Lichtman's reports about Jewish people being killed in Germany imagination. When the Zionist organization, the WJC, got vital news about a plan to gas Jews by the Nazis, they would collaborate with America and the British to keep it out of the press. Finally, in November of 1942, when the WZO finally had to admit publicly that the Nazis were systemically and industrially killing the Jews, they would I'm so sorry. In 1942, the WZO would be finally forced to admit that the Nazis were killing Jews publicly. However, this whole time they had known privately. And in fact, they had been using the killing of Jews within Europe to pressure the British to give them more supplies. While the Holocaust and its horrors set in for Jews all around the world, this was not going to get in the way of building Israel. Dov Joseph, the director of the political department in the Jewish Agency, would warn of publishing data exaggerating the number of Jewish victims. For if we announce that millions of Jews have been slaughtered by the Nazis, we will justifiably be asked where the millions of Jews are. For whom we claim that we shall provide a home in Israel after the war ends. End quote. So Zionists would actively support suppressing numbers of Jews being killed in Europe and publishing news stories about Jews being killed by the Nazis. Gerberbaum, an Israeli leader and first interior minister of Israel, would say, quote, that he thought nothing could be done to save Europe's Jews, and that money sent to Europe for escape or resistance would be wasted, end quote. Gerberbaum would even say, when asked by other Israelis to put the European people first, I do not accept such a saying. And when he would be asked to give money to save Jews in the diaspora, he would simply say, no, end quote. And that can be found in Gerberbaum's memoirs. One of the greatest badasses of the Jewish community in World War II would be the Slovakian Jewish fighter, Rabbi Michael Weissmendel, who would thoroughly denounce Zionism and fight the Nazis as a militant. Rabbi Weissmendel would attempt to raise money to pay off the Nazis to leave the Jews of Slovakia alone. While he was in Berlin trying to raise that money, his biggest opposition would be other Zionists. Weissmendel himself was not a Zionist. He hated Zionists. Zionist Sally Mayer would say to Weissmendel when he was trying to raise money to save Slovakian Jews, quote, "The letters you have gathered from the Slovakian refugees in Poland are exaggerated tales of the way of the Ostjuden, who are always demanding money," end quote. Weissmendel would also reportedly receive a letter from the WZO saying, "We, the Jewish people, need to spill blood if we are going to get a seat at the bargaining table when they are dividing the nations at the end of the war," end quote. It should be noted, though, that this letter has been in contention. We don't know whether it's real or not. Greenberg, an American Zionist, would be one of the few Zionists to call out his fellow Zionists on their complacency within the Holocaust. He would say in 1943, "There have appeared some Zionists in our midst who have become reconciled with the thought that it is impossible to stay the hand of murder, and therefore it is necessary to utilize this opportunity to emphasize to the world the tragedy of Jewish homelessness and to strengthen the demand for Jewish national home in Palestine." A home for whom? The millions of dead? Their temporary cemeteries in Europe? End quote. America's leading Zionist figure, Stephen Wise, when America was debating a Jewish rescue bill, would actually testify against that bill because it didn't mention Palestine. Ultimately, Goldman would admit decades later in 1963 that the American Zionists had been completely inactive in stopping the Holocaust. He said, The main responsibility rests on us because we did not go far enough beyond routine petitions and requests, and because the Jewish communities did not have the courage or daring to exert pressure upon democratic governments by drastic means and to force them to drastic measures. I will never forget the day when I received a cable from the Warsaw Ghetto asking us, the Jewish leaders in the United States, to hold a day and night vigil on the steps of the White House until the president decided to give the order to bomb the extermination camps and death trains. We refrained from doing this because most of the Jewish leadership was then of the opinion that we must not disturb the war effort of the free world against Nazism by stormy protests. End quote. The story of Hungarian Jews is probably one of the saddest in World War II, and of Zionist collaboration with Nazis. The Hungarian Jewish people, when they were taken over by the Nazis in 1944, knew what to expect. Polish Jewish refugees had flooded their country, and the industrialized Holocaust was already well on its way. When summoned by Nazi leaders, several Jewish leaders would sell out the Jewish people for political favors from the Nazis. Joel Brand, a Zionist, would get permission from the Nazis to negotiate upon 400,000 Jewish people in Slovakia's behalf. The deal would be basically that Joel Brand would negotiate to get the Nazis much needed supplies and they would release a good number of Jewish people. However, Joel Brand would be backstabbed by the WZO, which would turn him over to the British and allow the British to arrest him. When Joel Brand was finally released from prison, he would scream at the heads of the WZO in Tel Aviv, telling them that they let tens of thousands of Jewish people die. The WZO members in response would tell him to hush up the matter. Chaim Weizmann himself would ignore Joel Brand and would only meet him once and give him a trip back to Europe for free, but never talk to him again. When the WZO got detailed maps about rail lines in the Holocaust sent by them by Rabbi Weiss Mendel, the great Jewish fighter against Nazis, Weiss Mendel would ask them to pressure the British government to bomb the maps that he drew, which were sending Jews to the Holocaust. The WZO in response would say, quote, "The bombing of the death camps is hardly likely to achieve salvation of the victims to any appreciable extent. Its physical effects can only be destruction of the plant and personnel, and possibly the hastening of the end of those who are already doomed." End quote. Hungarian and Slovakian Jews were failed by the WZO. When the WZO would be asked to give even the slightest support to these Jewish groups, they would respond, quote, "Don't let us drift into the continental Jewish habits." End quote. Rezo Katzner, a Hungarian Zionist, would negotiate the export of a few select Jews from Hungary that were great for building up occupied Palestine. In exchange, he would promise the Zionists, the Nazis, to keep the rest of the Jews in the camps complacent. Katzner would be one of the greatest Zionist collaborators with the Nazis. One Nazi official would say of him later, quote, "He was not interested in old Jews or those that had become assimilated into Hungarian society, but he was incredibly persistent in trying to save the biologically valuable Jewish blood, that is, human material that was capable of reproduction and hard work. You can have the others," he would say, "but let me keep this group here." End quote. Katzner, his whole family, and the couple of Jews that he saved would eventually go to Palestine, while the rest of the Hungarian Jews would die. In 1955, the Israeli government would defend Katzner in court, who was being libeled in the press by Israeli journalists who were calling him a Nazi collaborator. The case would go all the way up to the Israeli Supreme Court. The Labor Party, which was defending Katzner, the Labor Party is the Labor Zionist Party, and it was the ruler of Israel at that time, and empowering Israel at the time. It would defend Katzner, the Nazi collaborator, to the very end. The Israeli government, in that case, in the side of Katzner, would argue, quote, "Katzner did nothing more and nothing less than was done by us in rescuing Jews and bringing them to Palestine. You are allowed, in fact, it is your duty to risk losing the many in order to save the few. It has always been our Zionist tradition to select a few out of the many in arranging the immigration to Palestine. Therefore, are we to be called traitors too?" End quote. During the trial, Katzner himself would be assassinated. It wasn't one big long trial. It was a trial that dragged out for months. But in the end, the Israeli Supreme Court would rule in the favor of Katzner. They would say, quote, "Katzner spoke in detail of the situation, saying the Hungarian Jew was a branch which long ago dried up on the tree. This vivid description coincides with the testimony of another witness about Hungarian Jews. This was a big Jewish community in Hungary without any ideological Jewish backbone. The question is not whether a man is allowed to kill the many in order to save the few, or vice versa. The question is altogether in another sphere, and should be defined as follows. A man is aware that a whole community is awaiting doom. He is allowed to make the efforts to save the few, although part of his effort involved the concealment of the truth to the many. Or should he disclose the truth to the many, in his best opinion, that this way everybody will perish? I think the answer is clear. What good will the blood of a few bring if everyone is to perish? The Israeli Supreme Court, essentially in that final decision, would sanction the killing of the hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews for the greater good of Israel. 450,000 Hungarian Jews ultimately died in the Holocaust because of Katzner's actions. In 1948, the Zionists in the state of Israel would make a deal with the Iraqi monarchy to send Iraqi Jews to Israel. However, many Iraqi Jews didn't want to leave Iraq. They loved living in Iraq. In order to get them to actually move, the Israeli state would work with the Iraqi monarchy to bomb Jewish communities in Iraq to encourage immigration. In 1970s, Israel throughout most of its foundation was ruled by the labor Zionists and the labor Zionist ideology, which claimed to be socialist, it really wasn't, which claimed to be democratic, it really wasn't, but it at least gave the illusion of democracy and the illusion of liberalism, right? It was fascism with its mask on. In 1977, with the election of Prime Minister Ben-Gvir and the revisionist Zionism would take over Israel, and the mask of fascism would come off the Israeli state. Netanyahu, who was elected in 1993 under the Likud party, which has been the ruling party of Israel since then, would write in a book, quote, "Violence is ubiquitous in the political life of all Arab countries. It is the primary method of dealing with opponents, both foreign and domestic, and Arab and non-Arab." Therefore, according to Netanyahu, his plan in 1993 was not to have any compromise with the Palestinians and to get Israel to expand its iron wall in the Golan Heights, in the West Bank, and other places for a one-state solution. Netanyahu has been Israel's longest-serving prime minister. The Iron Wall theory got its biggest challenge in October 7th, 2023, with the Gaza ghetto uprising. This attack has humiliated the Iron Wall theory, and Netanyahu and the Israeli government's current attacks on Gaza really seem to be a response in their final last battle cries to keep up their Iron Wall theory, which is the theory that we must constantly be attacking the Jewish people and have this military garrison and iron wall through force against the Arab people. As journalist Chris Bambury has pointed out about Netanyahu and Israel in the modern day, quote, "His logic is at the heart of Zionism, but the wall is rusty. Israel does not seem invincible. The clock of history is ticking for Israel and Zionism."
This episode of the Pokepreet Pod has been brought to you by our generous members on our Patreon. If you'd like to become one of them, go to patreon.com/thepokepreetpod. Thank you.
What the fuck? Glory to Stalin, I barely made it.
And special shout out to our first member of the Marshal of the Soviet Union tier, Mateus T.